numbers of cases, but no one cares from the public, even from the government. Everything is reopened, like wide open.
Well,
and yeah, it's sad because people are careless, and they don't see, like, what if you don't see someone from your family is sick, so everything is fine.
yeah. Well, I hope people continue to use responsible distancing, masks, hand washing, and other good hygiene practices. Those have been shown to be very effective. And as you can see from the experience in the United States, where that has not been happening, you get a large rebound of new cases. So I'm wishing you very good luck with that.
The talk today is about the warming world, like the Middle East. Can we consider Middle East as a warming world?
Absolutely, and I'll show you all some of the latest studies on this.
Wow. لسه قدامنا قد ايه يا شباب ونبدأ؟
Now we are.
Okay.
So yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, we can start, Nancy.
الآن موعدنا مع جون ستيرمان، أستاذ ورئيس قسم الأنظمة الديناميكية بجامعة MIT، وأحد أبرز الناشطين في العالم في مجال التغير المناخي بحياتنا. يحدثنا في هذه الجلسة تحت عنوان التغير المناخي، المشكلات الحالية وطرق الحل المستقبلية، ويحاورها المهندس محمد رضا. نظرا لتقديم هذه المحاضرة باللغة الإنجليزية تتوفر الترجمة الفورية من خلال الضغط على زر الكرة الأرضية.
And now with our keynote session with our Professor John Sterman, the professor and the chair of the Department of Dynamic Systems at MIT University, and one of the most prominent activists in the world in the field of climate change. In this session, he'll deliver under the title of Building a Prosperous, Sustainable Society in a Warming World. And since the lecture is presented in English, a simultaneous interpretation is available by pressing the globe button, and also choose the second channel, which is the French channel. The interpretation is provided by our interpreter, Dr. Mohammed Abou Laila. And now the mic with you, Professor John.
Well, thank you very, very much, Mohammed. Ashraf, I'm very pleased to be joining you all for Arab Science Week 2020. Please do post your questions and comments in the chat. This is not going to be the normal talk that you might have seen about climate change. In fact, we know that those kinds of talks are not very effective. In fact, research shows that showing people research doesn't work. There's a long history of risk communication research showing that research shows that showing people research doesn't work. So we're going to do something quite different from what most of you have experienced before. Over this next hour, what I'm going to do is invite you all to use our interactive climate simulation tools to design a set of policies and actions that can create a safer world by addressing the threat of climate change. So let me start out by saying that all the simulations that I'm going to show you today are available for free to anyone anywhere in the world. And I'll post the website where you can find them and use them for yourselves at the end of this talk. I'm also going to be staying on after the hour in case anybody has additional questions or comments. I can stay for some minutes afterwards to address specific questions. So let me tell you why my group and our partner Climate Interactive, a nonprofit in the United States, why we've developed these interactive climate simulation tools. And I'd like to go through this quickly so we can actually give you a chance to use them. We've developed these tools, which are rigorously grounded in the best available science, to give people across the world the opportunity to learn for themselves about the threat of climate change and what we can do about it. We've presented these models for a very wide range of policy leaders, elected officials, business leaders, leaders in civil society, educators, the media, and ordinary citizens all around the world. You see a few examples here. So, for example, former Secretary of Energy Ernest Moniz, the former head of the UNFCCC, Christiana Figueres, the top negotiators for the United States in the climate realm, and they have all personally used the simulations that we're going to show you today, and including former Secretary of State John Kerry, shown here speaking at the 2016 UNFCCC Climate Summit in Marrakesh. And I was there, and in fact, I was there to hear that speech. I've personally briefed Secretary Kerry twice on our models, most recently this past February. And here you can read his comment that these models work, they're important, they're getting broad dissemination, and I used it, he said. And he really did. He's actually used it, meaning he took the laptop, he ran the simulation himself. Similarly, John Holdren, President Obama's science advisor for both of President Obama's terms, used the model as one of their analytical supports for the global climate negotiations and the bilateral negotiation with China that resulted in an important agreement in 2014. Since the current administration has been in the White House, we've been working with leaders in the US Congress, governors, and members of other nations, leaders from other nations. You can see a few here. The important thing about this is that our approach is rigorously grounded in the science. We are rigorously nonpartisan, and we're taking a global approach. So although we, being located in the United States, have focused a lot of our energy lately on the US Congress, senators, members of the House of Representatives, state governors, this is a global model, and it's getting use all around the world. For example, here you see one of my team members running an interactive simulation workshop for government, business, and civil society leaders in Indonesia. This was in Bali last year. So it's also been used by important leaders such as the Dalai Lama. I had the opportunity to present it to him twice at MIT. And you can read his comment here after participating. And the question is, what can you do? It's lovely to see that senators, political leaders, religious leaders like His Holiness the Dalai Lama have used the simulation. That's nice. None of it really counts. What counts is what can you get out of it? So let's go and take a look at it right now. So the challenge for you all is how to limit the expected global warming to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. This is the simulation. We're no longer in PowerPoint. This is the live simulation. We call it En-ROADS, the Energy Rapid Overview and Decision Support System. It's freely available, and as I said, I'll post the website for you at the end of our session. So what you're seeing here is the output of the model. On this graph on the top left, you have global total primary energy production by source from 2000 through the year 2100. And you can see how much energy is generated by coal, that's the bottom wedge in brown, from oil in red, natural gas in blue, renewables, hydro, wind, solar, geothermal, energy storage for the variable renewables in green, bioenergy from all forms of biomass here, and then nuclear power on top. We have historical data up through the most recent available information. And then the projection here is a reference case or business as usual case in which there are no new actions to address the climate challenge beyond those that have already been implemented. And you can see that under that reference case, total global primary energy use continues to grow very substantially. And the reason for that, of course, is population growth, which you can see here using the UN's median fertility projection by region. So here, the United States in red, the European Union in green. Underneath that, the other developed countries. China is the tan orange color. India is light blue. And all the other developing countries in the world, all the other countries in the world, which includes the MENA nations, that's in this large growing blue band. And as you know, almost all the population growth projected over the remainder of this century is expected to take place in your countries and the other developing nations around the world. So that growing population drives a need for more energy. That also is being driven by economic growth. So here you can see our reference case assumption that on average for the world as a whole, GDP per capita will continue to grow at about 2.5% per year, very close to the average rate. But if we break it down by region again, you can see some regions grow faster than others, China, for example, and the historic gaps between the nations in terms of their wealth and their income remain. This is one scenario you can use. Other scenarios are available. And just to illustrate the way the model works, you could assume faster or slower economic growth. Here slower, here faster. And as I move the slider, you immediately see the impact on energy use, on greenhouse gas emissions, that's in the graph on the right, and on the amount of global warming expected to occur by the year 2100. In the reference case, 4.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So why is that happening? Well, this pattern of energy use is dominated by continued reliance on fossil fuels, and that generates substantial emissions of carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases, which you can see in this graph. The green band is the emissions of greenhouse gases from forests and land use. The largest contribution today is from the combustion of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Then we have a contribution from the fluorinated hydrocarbons, CFCs, PFCs, HFCs, et cetera. Very long-lived, very powerful greenhouse gases. Then we have methane, a very powerful greenhouse gas, and nitrous oxide, and in purple on top, also a very potent greenhouse gas with a long atmospheric lifetime. Most of the nitrous oxide comes from agriculture. Most of the methane, industry and agriculture, all the CO2, the gray band here, from the burning of fossil fuels. So your challenge is to tell me right now, using chat, what we should do, what you should do to limit global warming to no more than 2 degrees, which you see right here. The Paris Agreement, and we were there with our model assisting, calls for no more than 2 degrees of warming by 2100 and striving for significantly less warming, in particular, striving for 1.5 degrees. Now, let me be clear, 2 degrees is not safe. It is just less harmful. It is safer than 4.1. And well, let's talk for a minute about what would happen at 4.1 degrees. And while I'm doing this, please enter into the chat what you think we should do to bring that curve down, to bend that curve so it doesn't go over 2 degrees. I'm not going to choose for you. That's not an appropriate role. What you need to do is tell me what actions, what policies do you believe can help bend that curve. In the model, you can tax, subsidize, incentivize, or regulate any of the energy sources: coal, oil, natural gas, bioenergy, renewables like wind and solar, nuclear. You have a new technological breakthrough, something that doesn't exist today that you could use. You could put a price on carbon dioxide emissions, carbon pollution. You can work on the energy efficiency of the end uses, transportation, buildings, industrial processes. You can electrify the transportation system or buildings or industry. You can work on land use, cut deforestation, promote the planting of new trees, afforestation. You can work on the emissions of methane and the other greenhouse gases that you see here, for example, the nitrous oxide, the methane, the fluorinated gases. And you could invest in potential carbon dioxide removal technologies. So I need you to suggest in the chat right now what you think we ought to try. And while I'm doing that, let me show you what the impacts of doing nothing might be. So as I just showed you, the expected amount of warming is over 4 degrees C above pre-industrial levels by 2100 and still rising. Now, what does that mean? It means, and I'm going to say this in as sober, measured way as I can, it means catastrophe for humanity. Let me illustrate with just a few slides showing you what might happen in your region of the world at that kind of warming. So first of all, what would happen with the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Well, today it's about 415 parts per million. It's projected under this scenario to go over 800 parts per million. Over 800 parts per million. We have never experienced that in the entire history of human beings on this planet. In fact, today, at 415 parts per million, it is higher than it has ever been since before there were humans on the planet Earth. So what about sea level rise? Well, the expected sea level rise by 2100 is over 1.2 meters, but that has very conservative assumptions about the climate. It's quite likely that it could be more. It could be perhaps 2 meters of sea level rise. That's not what we expect, but it is within the realm of possibility. So that's a very serious threat. Let's take a quick look at some of the other impacts. Well, let's talk first about sea level rise. So this is the Nile Delta today. And as you know, approximately 1/3 of the Delta is below current sea levels. And that's a combination, that's due to a combination of sea level rise and subsidence of the land due to withdrawals of fresh water in the Delta region. Well, if we had 2 meters of sea level rise, which is possible by 2100, what would it look like? I don't think I need to tell you what a catastrophe that would be for Egypt, for the MENA nations, and for the world as a whole. Let me show you a few others relevant to your region. This is the Ganges Delta on the border of India and Bangladesh. And the red area shows you the land that is projected to be below the typical average annual flood level by the year 2050, just 30 years from now, when most of the people in your nations will still be alive and they will be raising their families. And you can see that the flood level goes all the way up to Dakar and beyond. This will cause, and is already causing, climate refugees, most of whom end up in Dakar now because that's where the jobs are. Let's take a look at the other side, at the Indus River Delta. So here you see how much more of the Indus Delta would be below the expected average annual flood level by 2050. Now, the reason this is important is it will displace millions of people from their livelihoods on a border between two nations that don't get along very well today, and just in the past year shot down one another's aircraft. This is a major geopolitical threat, and amplified by the fact that, as you know, both these nations have nuclear weapons. Let's take a look at the Persian Gulf. So this is the head of the Gulf, showing Basra and the Tigris and Euphrates river basins, and a huge area in Iraq and surrounding nations, including some of coastal Iran here, would be inundated in this scenario. And here's Abu Dhabi, just as an example. The results are similar for the other Emirates, and you can find all of this information for yourself at our partner climatecentral.org, where they have done some of the very best work to map the consequences of sea level rise. This is what happens if we take no action. It's, of course, worse than that. Here's the Maldives as an example of one of the low-lying island states in the world. The entire archipelago of the Maldives is basically coral reef and is only 2 meters above sea level today. It simply won't survive if we allow business as usual. Now, what happens to other consequences of climate change in your region? Well, this is the result of simulations showing what happens to water availability, precipitation, and how many days per year are going to be in drought conditions. Around the world, much of the world is expected to become significantly drier and more prone to drought. And the region of the world that is most heavily affected is going to be the Mediterranean basin and your nations. And you can see this right here, especially Morocco, all along the North African coast, all the way through Egypt, Middle East here, and Turkey, and continuing eastward through Afghanistan, Pakistan, and many other nations. Significantly more drought in a region that's already water stressed. There's consequences of that, including significant drops in precipitation. So this is a paper that just came out within the last month by my colleagues at MIT, including a project led by Professor El-Tahir. And what they did is they examined the Mediterranean region in particular to understand why the Mediterranean and North Africa, Middle East are going to be far more heavily affected, harmed by climate change than the rest of the world on average. It has to do with the patterns of winds. The paper is freely available. I urge you to take a look at it, but you can see here the warming expected for the Mediterranean North Africa region is expected to be significantly worse than in the rest of the world. And the consequence of that will be a large drop, continuing drop in precipitation and annual rainfall in the region. Clearly, that threatens crop yields. It threatens every aspect of the economies of all of your nations. There's extreme weather. This shows Typhoon Idai from last year, which hit Mozambique more than 1,300 people were killed, but even more importantly, it's estimated that the gross domestic product of Mozambique fell by 10%. And of course, a developing country like Mozambique can ill afford that kind of economic devastation. Wildfire risk is much greater. This is a photo from the wildfires around Athens in 2018. And so what I'm telling you is, it is unacceptable for us to accept this situation where we're headed for more than 2 degrees before the year 2050. So what should we do? So I'm looking in the chat now. And
am I allowed to interrupt you to
several
to
very
say
good
answers,
suggestions.
what answer we have?
Yes, so
some people say that increase renewable energy and decrease oil and carbon.
great. So
Another saying that we can limit the use of cars and use public transports instead.
Great. So let's try some of these in the simulation. So let's start by promoting renewable energy. Okay, so right here we see renewables. And if I pull this slider, we are promoting, incentivizing, subsidizing renewable energy, wind, solar, onshore, offshore, utility scale, and the energy storage, smart grid technologies we need to make use of those variable renewables. So let's try a fairly substantial policy, and it helps. So take a look at right here. The green wedge is much bigger than it was. Let me go back. No action, highly subsidized. And let's just go back and take a look at that. You can see the green wedge here gets much bigger. And it helps. It lowers the expected warming by 0.2 degrees. It's not enough by itself, but it helps. Now, why isn't it enough by itself? Well, it takes a while to get all of the renewables deployed around the world. And you can vary the assumptions. We could make it faster or slower. But in the meantime, you're still burning a lot of fossil fuel. And all of that carbon dioxide is going into the atmosphere now and warming the planet every year all the way through 2100 and beyond. Because once carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, on average, a molecule of CO2 stays in the atmosphere and warms the planet for at least 100 years. So that's a great idea. What else can we do? Well, some of the suggestions here include improving energy efficiency in the transportation sector. So let's try that. Let's increase the energy efficiency of transportation infrastructure. Cars, light duty vehicles, heavy trucks, rail, mass transit, long distance rail, seaborne, waterborne shipping, and aviation. And that helps, again, another 1/10 of a degree. We can also electrify the transport sector. Now, we don't envision electrification of aviation or waterborne shipping. So we are going to, in our model, we restrict the electrification to land-based transportation. Let's try that. And it helps a little bit. But, you know, there's something interesting going on here. Take a look at this policy. When we electrify, so I'll pull the lever all the way, okay? Take a look at what happens. 1 degree, 1/10 of a degree improvement. That's important, but why isn't it more? Watch over here on the left. Watch what happens to coal and oil, for example. So let's try electrification. The oil wedge gets a lot smaller because more and more of the land-based vehicles are using electrons instead of gasoline, petrol, diesel. But what's getting bigger is the coal wedge. A little bit more natural gas, a little bit more renewables, a little bit more nuclear too, but a lot more coal. What's happening is you're substituting coal for gasoline. So tailpipe emissions go down, and air quality on the streets of Cairo and Casablanca and cities all around your region would get better, but smokestack emissions get worse. So there's a very important lesson here. It's not enough to electrify the end uses. You also have to decarbonize the electric grid and the energy system as fast as possible to get the real benefit. So let's do that. Let's eliminate new construction of coal infrastructure. So right here, I'm going to click this button and it will stop all new development of coal infrastructure, coal-fired power plants, coal mines, coal for metallurgical purposes. And that means other forms of energy will be needed and are available to provide the energy we need to make the electricity we want. So let's see what happens if we do that. That has a very large impact. We're now down to 3.3 degrees of expected warming. So that's a very powerful high leverage point in the system. And now let's go back and see, we'll take away electrification. We're at 3.4. If we massively electrify, we don't get more coal now. We still get less oil. We have more natural gas and more renewables and more nuclear. Now we're at 3.3. So natural gas is a fossil fuel. It's not as bad as coal, but it's still a very significant contributor to global warming. So we also need to do something about natural gas. And it takes a very long time to transition the installed base and the infrastructure for electric vehicles away from oil towards electric. So there's still a tremendous amount of oil being used in the system and also in buildings and industry. So we can electrify buildings also. That helps a lot. Now we're getting a lot more natural gas, a lot more renewables, more nuclear, less oil, but we're still only at 3.2. Why? Well, we're still dependent on fossil fuels. Some coal, but it's declining. A lot of oil for the next 20, 30 years, and a lot of natural gas. And natural gas is a very powerful greenhouse gas, especially methane that leaks from the natural gas production supply chain all the way from wellheads to the final consumer. So what can we do about that? Well, there's a variety of other suggestions in the chat. Let's see. Well, reduce the use of coal, which we tried. More renewable energies, more electric vehicles, which we've tried, and it's helpful. And other suggestions that will come as well. So we could try subsidizing nuclear energy. We've subsidized renewables. Let's subsidize nuclear as well by about the same amount. So what does it do for us? Not very much. 3.2 to 3.1. You get a lot more nuclear, but you don't get as many renewables. If electric utilities find that it's more attractive to invest in nuclear, then they will do so, but that means they will invest less in utility scale solar, wind, and other renewable technologies. So there's a bit of a substitution effect there. You don't see much impact, but I can leave nuclear in the mix for right now. The main challenge is decarbonizing as fast as possible. So one thing that I don't see suggested yet is a price on carbon dioxide emissions. So a price on carbon pollution. So that's right here. Why don't we try a moderate carbon price? You're probably aware that most of the major oil companies in the world have now publicly endorsed the idea that worldwide we should have a meaningful price on carbon. They are suggesting approximately $40 per ton of carbon dioxide. So what does that translate to in terms of the price of gasoline, petrol at the pump? Well, in the United States, that would raise the price of gasoline at the pump by about 36 cents. This would leave the price of gasoline in the United States far, far below current European levels. So it's a very small tax, but let's see what it would do. It has a large impact, even at $40 a ton. Now we're phasing it in over 10 years, and you can see the impact here. Here we are before it, and here's the impact. It reduces coal, even though we're stopping new construction. Existing coal plants become uneconomic. It reduces oil, and it reduces natural gas. We're filling the gap with more renewables and more nuclear. Now, $40 a ton isn't very much. Most economists believe that the appropriate price is much, much higher. Let's try $100 a ton. That's 92 cents on a gallon of gasoline in the United States. It would raise the price of gasoline in China by approximately 10, 12%, something on that order. And that's worth a lot more, because what is a price on carbon doing for you? It's not only encouraging a switch from the fossil fuels to the low carbon, zero carbon sources like renewables, like nuclear, it's reducing energy demand. And you can see that here. If we look at total global energy demand, it's much lower than it was in the reference case. Now, don't misunderstand what this means. Nobody wants barrels of oil, tons of coal, cubic feet of natural gas. Nobody wants that. What people want is warm or cool housing, mobility, so they can access economic and cultural and educational opportunities. They want healthcare. They want safe neighborhoods. They want those things. They don't want barrels of oil. Energy is important in achieving the real goals people have, but it's not the goal by itself. And what you're seeing here is that people's genuine needs and wants, opportunity, jobs, education, healthcare, housing, etc., are being satisfied, are being met with less energy because of increased energy efficiency. And the carbon price encourages that as well. Now, we can do better. I've seen in the chat that there's suggestions about cutting deforestation and also promoting the planting of new trees on land that isn't forested now or has already been deforested. So let's go back here, showing the emissions. So we've dramatically cut greenhouse gas emissions from the industrial side. We haven't done anything much yet on the forestry or land use side. So let's cut deforestation. Now, I'm not going to cut it all the way because a lot of it is generated by indigenous and poor people in developing nations who clear that land in order to be able to grow subsistence crops. But let's cut it by about half. And that's gotten us down to 2.6 from 2.7. So that's helpful. And you can see now here, we have negative emissions from the forestry sector by about mid-century. What about planting trees? Let's plant quite a lot of trees. That helps, down another 1/10, more negative emissions. Now, you may be familiar with the concept of the Trillion Trees Initiative that's been heavily promoted by a variety of organizations in the last year. The idea is if we could plant 1 trillion trees around the world, maybe that would solve the entire climate crisis. Well, let's try it. Right now I have a moderate amount of afforestation. Let's pull it all the way over. 2.4. It's not worth that much. How come? This graph in the bottom right shows the rate at which carbon dioxide is being removed from the atmosphere by those trillion trees. And we're starting the program today. We're starting to plant those trees today. We're assuming that it takes a decade to gain the land rights for all that planting, and that it takes 30 years to get all that planting to be accomplished. Well, that's perhaps too conservative. Let's be more optimistic. So let's assume that we could gain all the land rights today, immediately, and plant all the trees on a crash program basis in just 5 years. 2.3, it doesn't make that much difference. How come? Well, the main effect is it simply takes a very long time for these trees to grow. On average, perhaps 80 years, but many decades. And you can see what happens. We're getting a lot of CO2 being removed from the atmosphere here by 2060, 10 billion tons of CO2 per year. That's a lot. Total global emissions today are around 52, 55 billion tons. So that's a very substantial amount, but it doesn't come until the last half of the century. And by then, most of the damage from fossil fuel combustion is still happening. You can see the gray wedge here, that's your fossil fuel emissions. And planting trees is great. We encourage it, but it is not a silver bullet for this problem. You'll also see that the removal peaks and declines. That's because eventually trees will die. And that can happen because of climate change, wildfire, water shortage, extreme weather, insect pests, disease, logging, legal and illegal logging. And so the carbon in those trees eventually returns to the atmosphere. So planting trees is great in most places in the world. It can help, but it is no silver bullet, even with these incredibly optimistic assumptions about how fast we could do it. And the longer we wait, the worse it is. So let's leave that in the mix. What else can we do? Well, we've improved energy efficiency dramatically for transportation, and we've electrified transportation and buildings, commercial, residential buildings, and end use. Let's improve energy efficiency for the end use sector. And that helps. We're now getting the services we want: warm housing in the winter, cool in the summer, or in many of your countries. We're getting opportunity, education, employment, but with less energy. We're using it far more efficiently. We're down to 2.2. What else would matter? Well, you can see we haven't done that much for the methane or the nitrous oxide yet, or the fluorinated gases. So let's take a look at that. There is less methane being generated, and that's a consequence of using less natural gas, using less coal, using less oil. And so the refining and extraction distribution process, we're producing less methane, but instead of falling, it's basically flat. So what we'll do is we'll implement policies that can reduce those other greenhouse gases by modest amounts. And there we are, we're at 2 degrees. And we haven't assumed any technological magic. Now, this conclusion has very important implications. First of all, I don't need to assume very aggressive tree planting here. We can still achieve 2 degrees with rather modest reductions in methane, nitrous oxide. And we know how to do this. We know how to do it with existing technology. We can do it today. We don't even really need to subsidize nuclear. If I take away the nuclear subsidy and the renewable subsidy, we don't need it. Why? Because the price on carbon is providing sufficient economic incentives, and we're getting more renewables and we're getting more nuclear because we've made the fossil fuels more expensive than the renewable zero carbon fuels. We do need to keep the coal in the ground. We need the carbon price to discourage fossil fuels and encourage substitutes of renewables and nuclear. We need energy efficiency on the end use side. And once you've done that, once you've decarbonized the electric system, then electrification of transportation and end uses makes a big difference. We need to cut deforestation. Planting some trees is helpful, and we need to reduce methane and the other greenhouse gases. If we do that, here's a plausible scenario that limits the warming to 2 degrees, no more than 2 degrees. And it does so without requiring any radical technical breakthroughs. Now, hey, I'm a professor at MIT. I love technology. I love innovation. And I'm hoping that we do have some important technical breakthroughs, perhaps an artificial leaf technology that would directly convert carbon dioxide and sunlight into, for example, hydrogen that we could use as an energy carrier, or carbon dioxide removal technologies, which are included in the model, but which we don't need. This is important. Many people say the solution for climate change is innovation and investment in R&D for radical new energy technologies like fusion, or a 4th generation intrinsically safe nuclear power plant, or carbon dioxide removal. So as I say, that would be lovely, but you cannot schedule a breakthrough. And putting our hope, all of our hopes on achieving such a breakthrough, that's not a wise strategy. What you see here is that it is possible to limit warming to no more than 2 degrees, and even do better, higher carbon price, a little more reduction in methane, maybe some more deforestation reduction. We can go below 2 degrees in expectation, and we can do that with technologies that are available today, ready to go off the shelf. So let me show you just a couple of pieces of data about the possibilities here, and then we'll stop and see what kinds of comments and questions you have. And again, let me stress that this is entirely freely available. And in fact, up here where it says share your scenario, if you click here, you can send out your scenario, this scenario, immediately on your favorite social media platform. Or what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to paste it into the chat, and it will go to all the panelists. And what I would ask is if the hosts would capture that and send it to everybody on this call right now, all 60 some odd of you, then all you have to do is click on that link and you'll be taken right to this scenario, and you'll be able to work with it yourself. So if the hosts for the meeting could capture that link that I've just posted and share it with everybody, that would be great. So now the question that comes up is, okay, we did it in the simulation. You did it. This is largely your suggestions that I've read in the chat here, and I thank you for those. Can we do it in the real world? And the answer is yes. So first of all, we had, as an important part of our strategy, a carbon price of $100 a ton. That's not that much. Doesn't raise the price of gasoline that much. It's enough to flip the electric generation system from fossil to renewables. But a lot of people say, oh, but a price on carbon, that's never going to happen. That's just not true. Here you can see there is a price on carbon now in many countries of the world. And let me show you here. So this data comes from the World Bank. It's already a year old, but there are already 57 countries or provinces or states or regions of the world that have a carbon price already today. They span approximately 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the prices on average are too low, although almost $130 per ton of CO2 in Sweden, but they're too low. and they raise a fair amount of revenue, much of which is rebated to individual citizens as a dividend or invested in alternative energy, low carbon energy. So if you hear somebody say, oh, of course, economists tell you that a price on carbon is the single best thing we can do to limit climate change, the model we just worked with shows that indeed that is true. It is a very high leverage policy. It's not enough by itself, but it is an essential policy. It's the one policy to take with you to a desert island if you can only take one. But of course, we don't have to take just one. We can do a variety of other policies simultaneously, reducing deforestation, planting trees, reducing methane and nitrous oxide emissions, improving energy efficiency, electrifying our transportation and buildings and industry. We can do these things now at the same time we put a price on carbon. So if you hear people say, of course, a carbon price is the right thing to do, very often the next thing they say is, but of course it will never happen. Well, it is already happening. And it is a fundamental theorem of modal logic that anything that exists is possible. This is happening already today, and including in some of the largest countries in the world, including China, Australia, countries in South America, Canada, Mexico, Western Europe, even Turkey. So this is possible. At the same time, the prices of renewables, wind, solar, and storage have fallen so much. The price of solar has fallen 90% in the last 10 years. And so in many parts of the world, it is now cheaper to design, permit, build, and operate solar farms with storage than it is to operate existing fossil fuel plants. So here's an example from Colorado. Well, most of your countries are a lot hotter and sunnier than Colorado. Here's an example from southern Texas, El Paso, West Texas, right on the Mexico border. And here you see the electric utility in El Paso put out requests from producers for new electric capacity, and the winning bids, the lowest prices, were for solar projects with storage coming in at record low prices, 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour, 2.1 cents per kilowatt hour with storage. This is a region very similar to many regions in many areas of your region, where in fact you have better solar resource even than West Texas. Here you see how the costs of renewables have fallen dramatically. A 90% drop in the cost of solar over the past decade, a 70% drop in the cost of wind, an 80% drop in the cost of lithium-ion battery storage. That means these renewables with storage are now cheaper than coal, cheaper than nuclear, cheaper even than gas with combined cycle turbines. This has profound implications. And this is not just a United States phenomenon. Here you see a new study from the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, showing that more than half of all the renewables added in 2019 were cheaper than the cheapest new coal plants. This has profound implications for you all and your countries, especially those of you who are from oil and gas exporting countries in the Gulf and Saudi, for example. It means any new investment in those fossil infrastructures to produce more natural gas and oil, to refine more oil, those investments are going to become, if they're not already, uneconomic. They will become stranded assets, and you will end up writing them off. You will end up losing money on them. The consequence of all this, of course, is a dramatic transition that's now underway. I could tell you more about energy efficiency and why it is the fastest, safest, cheapest way for us to get where we want to go. But let me instead try to summarize, and then we'll have a few minutes for discussion. what you've done today with our interactive model, you've faced up to the challenge. Human-caused climate change is a grave threat to our prosperity, to our health, and our lives. And I showed you how your region, the MENA countries, are going to suffer more from climate change than many other nations in the form of extreme heat, drought, water shortage, crop yield decline, sea level rise, and others. This has obvious geopolitical implications, migration, conflict. I don't need to go farther into that. I'm sure you're well aware of those risks. The good news is it is still possible to have a good chance of limiting warming to no more than 2 degrees. It is absolutely technically possible. We have the technology we need today. Further improvements are welcome, but they aren't necessary. And it's basic, simple technologies, many of which are available now, ready to go off the shelf. Just as a very quick example, I'm sitting here in my own home, which was built about 100 years ago. 5 years ago, my wife and I did a deep energy retrofit on our home. Lots of extra insulation, high quality windows, high efficiency appliances, a solar array on the roof, solar photovoltaic on the roof. We completely eliminated the natural gas heating system and installed air source heat pumps, heat pump hot water, LED lighting everywhere. And bottom line, over the past 5 full years for which we have data, we have made approximately 50% more energy than we use with no fossil fuels whatsoever. Our house is more comfortable. It is quieter. It's larger inside now without the old heating system and its radiators. And we have no electric bill. We have no gas bill. We have no heating bill. We have central air conditioning now for the first time, which we never had before. And the electric utility owes us more than $4,000, which we will use when we get electric vehicles. I'm a bicycle commuter, so I don't need an electric car right now. This is possible. It was quite affordable, and it's getting cheaper every day. The potential for solar, for wind, for energy efficiency in your countries is even better than it is here near MIT in Massachusetts. So it is absolutely possible to do this. But in order to do it, multiple actions are needed right away. We need a significant carbon price, ramping up to about $100 a ton, maybe even a little more. Give the money back to the people. This has already been done. If you think that's not politically possible, just consider Indonesia, where when the current president was first elected, he cut the subsidies for kerosene and for petrol, raising that cost, but rebated money to the citizens. So they were at least as well off as they were before. And there were no riots. It was well accepted. So give the money from the carbon price back to your citizens on an equal per capita basis. This will help the poor more than the wealthy who don't need the help, and it will provide significant incentives for everyone to become more efficient. We need rapid deployment of the renewables, solar, wind, rapid electrification of end uses and energy efficiency. And remember, as I just showed you, renewables are already cheaper than fossil fuels in many parts of the world and getting cheaper every day. The result of that is a rapid transition in your economies and in many other nations around the world. But I want to stress, in your economies, from fossil to renewables will improve the health of your people with far less air pollution on the streets. It'll create good jobs all over, not just concentrated in large industrial hubs. And it will help build sustainable prosperity for all of your countries. Now, how are we going to get there? Well, part of it is people need to learn for themselves about how this is possible and what they need to do. And so for that, I recommend that you explore our interactive simulation model, En-ROADS, and use it to help build support for action with all of the relevant constituencies in your society, just as we've done around the world with senior policymakers, business leaders, leaders in civil society, in education, and citizens at large. The model that I just showed you is freely available at n-roads.org, n-roads.org. You can also contact me at the email address shown here. I want to thank you very much, and I will be happy now to stay for however long is relevant for all of you and answer any particular questions you might have. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Professor Sterman, for such informative, useful, and amazing talk. I personally want to ask you like a question that came into my mind. After all of these aspects we have to put in our consideration, after those actions we have to take immediately, do you still have a hope?
Yes. So thank you for this question. It's a really important question. So I'm asked all the time, am I an optimist about the climate problem? And my answer is that I'm not an optimist and I'm not a pessimist. I'm not interested in predicting the future. And I think there's a good argument to be made that if we take an optimistic perspective that says there's nothing to worry about, technological innovation and markets will take care of the problem. If climate change gets bad enough, price of energy will rise, fossil energy will rise, renewables will get cheap, and problem solved. Or we'll put more R&D into fusion, or whatever it is, we'll get fusion energy, problem solved. I believe that's a self-defeating attitude, because it says there's nothing we need to do. Somebody else will take care of it for us. That's not how this problem is going to be solved. Everybody needs to step up. And I don't just mean personal action, like what I've done here in my own home. Personal action is very, very important. If you have the opportunity to put solar on your roof or on the headquarters of your business, you should pursue that to improve the energy efficiency, to switch to an electric vehicle. You should do that. It's important to walk your talk, to live in a way that's consistent with your values. But I mean more than that. I mean becoming active as a citizen, active in transforming your businesses, your organizations, and your society. And that requires collective action through the normal political processes in your nations. And the important thing about it is it's easier than most people think. We spoke briefly about energy efficiency. We built a new building for the Sloan School of Management at MIT about 10 years ago. We moved into the building about 10 years ago. I was co-chair of the building committee, and we made it a very green building for the time. Today, we could do much, much better. In fact, here's the building during winter, and it's a very efficient building. Now, it has a lot of sustainable features in it. You can read this here, but none of this was bleeding edge. None of this was exotic. It was all standard energy efficiency kinds of actions. Now, the question is, and this is a good question, just ask yourself, how much more do you think it cost to design and build the building with these features compared to a standard building? Right? So obviously we're going to have lower energy costs going forward because we should have a building that uses much less energy. But I'm talking about the upfront costs, the incremental capital. How much more? So I've asked that question to many hundreds of people, some of whom are professionals in this industry, and the average answer is 20% more. Well, that's just not true. we did a post audit, and you can see here that yes, we spent more on the windows and insulation and high efficiency lighting and so on, but then we saved money on capital because the HVAC system is smaller, the electrical distribution system is smaller, the air handling system is smaller. All of these capital cost savings arose because the building is more efficient. And the bottom line is it cost 0.25% more, almost nothing, just a few $100,000 on a $140 million project. And we're using 70% less energy for heating and cooling than a standard building. Now that's a 10-year-old building. Today's technologies are even cheaper, and you could achieve zero net energy. In fact, I have a good friend who's the CEO of a bank in Texas, very hot, very sunny, routinely over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, so approximately 40. They are about to complete their new corporate headquarters building, which will have zero net energy, also conserve water, and is not costing significantly more than the standard building. It's going to be net present value positive, as our building was. Our building generated a net present value of almost $10 million compared to the standard building, with a payback time far less than a year. So when people say, are you an optimist? My answer is, I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. I'm hopeful. What hope means here is, hope means I believe this is possible. And I believe that what I do and what we all do matters. And that only if we all get together and take action are we going to be able to make this transition and build a sustainable, prosperous, healthy world for ourselves and for all our children.
This example of building such a building within MIT campus is somehow associated to a question we have. How can a country like Egypt adopt such plans in developing its own architecture and avoiding risks? I think, do you have any plans when it comes to architecture that helps in climate change?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. And so I am not an expert on the building stock and the architecture and the historically important buildings in Egypt, in Cairo or Alexandria, for example, but there's a great deal of substandard housing there. What I can give you is an analogy to low-income housing for the poor in this country. So I described briefly what my wife and I were able to do in our own house. And we were able to do it because we own the house and MIT professors are well compensated, so we could afford to do it. But there are millions of people in the United States who live in substandard, low-income housing, and it is very, very inefficient, generates a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's not healthy for them to live there. So for example, within a mile or two of where I am right now in Massachusetts, which is a cold climate in the winter, every winter there are people who have to choose between heating and eating, because their utility bills are so high in the winter, by the end of the month, they've run out of money because they're poor. They have poor quality jobs, they have unreliable incomes, and they're living in this very, very inefficient housing. That means they're paying more for energy than people who live in more affluent circumstances. So what can we do about that? Well, several important experiments have been done around the world. I'll show you just one. This is a program from New Zealand. It's called Warm Up New Zealand. And what they did was doctors would prescribe better insulation, better windows, new heating systems for the housing of the poor, instead of, well, you're going to get sick in the winter because you've turned the heat down so much that it's cold all the time in your apartment. And even though you're wearing your winter coat and your hat and your mittens, it's too cold, you and your children are going to get sick. And we know that people get pneumonia and bronchitis and acute attacks of COPD, lung disease, basically. And they show up in the emergency room requiring acute treatment for these respiratory illnesses every winter because they have no choice. They have to turn the heat down so much to try to save money that, that they and their children get sick. And of course, the children don't do as well in school. The parents often lose their jobs because they have to take home to take care of their sick kids, or they get sick themselves and can't go to work. And you can see how that creates a spiral that could lead a family into poverty or even homelessness. So instead of prescribing more medicine or treating these people for their acute respiratory disease, they treat them by insulating their homes, putting in better windows, putting in a high efficiency heating system. And the consequence is now they can put the thermostat up to a decent level, stay warm in the winter, and their utility bills are still lower, so they have more money at the end of every month, so they can eat better. And their health improves, so their life outcomes are better. And healthcare costs go down. And you can see here that the benefits of this program are about 4 times the costs. And a lot of the benefits are health improvements. Now, this is just one example. It is absolutely possible to do this for low-income housing in the United States, in Europe, in New Zealand, all over the world. But I know some of you are thinking, well, but that's in a cold climate. What about hot climates like our countries? It's the same story. If you don't have air conditioning, especially in a world that's getting warmer and warmer, your health is at risk. Your productivity will drop. Your ability to keep your job, to be productive in your job, to get promoted will drop. And so the same opportunities are available here for low-income housing, for housing of the poor in all of your countries. Now, they can't pay for it themselves, not in this country, not in your countries. So this is an opportunity where the government has a role to step in. And the social and economic benefits of this will largely pay for themselves, or as you see here, more than pay for themselves. So it won't actually be a drain on your treasuries. It'll actually put more money to the treasury. I think the opportunities here are tremendous. And studies in the United States show that it creates jobs to do this, to deploy green energy. The health benefits are very dramatic. But a lot of people's mental models don't account for these so-called co-benefits. So when you're thinking about this, think about all of the advantages, all of the benefits. And what you'll find is in a large array of cases, there's what we call win-win opportunities, where you can improve health, you can improve economic welfare, you can create jobs at the same time that you're cutting greenhouse gas emissions.
This is amazing. We could end with this question. There are many reports published that pandemic has harnessed world climate to better status than ever. To which point those reports are true?
Great. So yeah, this is a great question to end with. So first, the data do show that during the early phase of the pandemic, when many countries around the world went into an economic lockdown, including the United States, most of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, many of your countries as well, greenhouse gas emissions fell. In fact, one study by Corinne Le Carre and her colleagues showed that the first 2 weeks of April of this year, global greenhouse emissions fell by 17%. That's a lot. But her group also showed that by May, they had rebounded most of the way back to where they were. So everyone in this business understands two important things. First, the impact of the pandemic is on global greenhouse emissions is, and I'll just say it this way, a blip. It's a blip. It's not going to lower concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It's not going to lower global temperatures. And let me show you here. If you see this graph right here, this is global greenhouse emissions worldwide, historical data. This little drop right there. Actually, let me see if I can, yeah. This little drop right there, that's the impact of the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009. It's tiny. The second thing I want to point out is that destroying the economy is the worst possible way to lower greenhouse gas emissions. So if somebody tells you, oh, emissions fell during the pandemic, but it's because we dramatically cut our economic activity, we went into a serious recession, therefore we can't afford to cut greenhouse emissions, that's just a lie. And I'm using that word very deliberately. That is not how we're going to solve this problem. And what I've just showed you is it is not only technically possible, but it is economically advantageous for us to cut our greenhouse gas emissions permanently while providing people with what they really want: cool housing in the summer and in the hot climates, warm housing in the winter in the cold climates, access to economic opportunity, access to education, access to cultural enrichment, healthcare, and so on. We can provide what people really want by permanently transitioning the economy to renewable, low carbon energy. Doing so will significantly improve our health, our welfare, our prosperity, and save lives around the world. That's what we can do. That's not a temporary kill the economy kind of move. The possibility is there. All we have to do is take it.
Thank you very much, Professor ستيرمان, for such an amazing talk. Thank you. We are really honored to have you with us, to get you closer to the Arabic audience, especially our countries. They are the countries that will be hit harshly from climate change. I hope everyone in the Middle East would watch this lecture and apply what we are saying.
Well,
thank you so much, and we hope to be with us again.
Well, thank you very much. It's been my pleasure. You see here again the information. So please, I invite you to try it for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. And you can join our growing global network of climate ambassadors, people who are bringing this interactive experience to policymakers, students, citizens, business leaders all around the world. We look forward to it. Thank you again very much.
Thank you, Professor ستيرمان.